Good morning, everybody. My name is Donatella Galella, and I wanted to welcome you to our conversation today, Disaffection as Resistance, Race, Gender, and the Cultural Politics of Unfeeling. I'll start off with some introductions. I'll turn things over to Dr. Xine Yao to talk about her book for a little bit. Then we'll turn to our moderator, Emily Mulvihill, who will ask a question, and then we'll open up the floor to everyone's question for this hour-long conversation. So I want to begin with the land acknowledgement developed with Native Studies faculty here at UC Riverside. We at UCR would like to respectfully acknowledge and recognize our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, the Coahia, the Tongva, the Luiseno, and the Serrano peoples, and all of their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. Today, this meeting place is home to many Indigenous peoples from all over the world, including UCR faculty, students, and staff, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these homelands. And as I say this, I'm thinking through how in Dr. Yao's fabulous book, in her second chapter, she thinks so carefully with Martin Delaney's work and thinking through fellow feelings of Black and Indigenous intimacies. But at the same time, she attends to transgressions from settler colonialism to slavery and erasures of Black and Indigenous women. And so when I do this acknowledgement, I'm mindful of ongoing critique and the material realities of settler colonialism and genocide, and wanted to lift up the just really careful, anti-colonial work that I think that Dr. Yao is modeling for us. So again, hi, I'm Dr. Donatella Galella. I am an associate professor here at UC Riverside. I'm a settler here in Riverside. And I wanted to begin by talking about how I'm so excited to host Dr. Xine Yao today and to have this event supported by the Center for Ideas in Society and our Faculty Commons Performing Difference Working Group. And I met Dr. Yao at the Futures of American Studies Institute many years ago, and I reflect now on thinking about disaffection as a survival strategy that I think some of us used to get through that week in Dartmouth. So I'll give now the formal bios of our speakers today. So Dr. Xine Yao is lecturer in American literature to 1900 at University College London. Their first book is Disaffected, The Cultural Politics of Unfeeling in 19th-Century America, which has already won Duke University Press's Scholars of Color First Book Award. Her honors include the American Studies Association's Yasuo Sakakibara Essay Prize, and their research has been supported by grants from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. She is a BBC Radio 3/AHRC New Generation Thinker and the co-host of PhDivas Podcast. And then our fabulous moderator for today, Emily Mulvihill, is a third-year PhD student in the English department here at UCR. She studies 19th-century American literature. Her research examines geography in hemispheric novels and newspapers with a focus on the 1850s. All right, Dr. Yao, why don't you take it away?
Thank you so much, Dr. Gala. It's a real honor to be able to speak to all of you, where I presume you're also on the West Coast, but I'm, of course, beaming in from the former heart of empire, where doing land acknowledgements don't hold the same weight, because when I was, as a colleague once pointed out, when I was talking about Indigenous literature, they pointed out that in this context, Indigenous has been appropriated by racist white people, basically Brexiteers. And there also tends to be this unthinking way where like conscientious scholars, but perhaps not quite conscientious enough scholars from, say, the settler colonies have been presenting in the former heart of empire, and then they will automatically like acknowledge like the original inhabitants of this land, like not quite knowing how that language has been so, again, co-opted by the discourses here. Like things, the way that racialization operates, and in particular regional textures, is something that I explore in my book, but it's also something that I've been experiencing myself in the UK, where unlike in North America, where it's been critiqued that Asian tends to overrepresent East Asianness, the detriment of Southeast Asian and South Asian. Asian here automatically means South Asian. And so oddly enough, that's why the term Oriental tends to be seen far more often, even on supermarket shelves, to designate like different parts of, the ethnic aisle, because people don't know that East Asian is even the phrase that is used to talk about the various countries that we used to designating that. I also wanted to acknowledge at the beginning that, especially for those people who are more junior in the room, those youth who are still students, that there's a way that this type of talk or book talk can seem to reify a linear trajectory of professional progress. And especially like, because Dawn and I are really lucky, and like we met and so many other brilliant people that we knew and met during that interesting, sometimes trying week, managed to get jobs in academia. And yet I think that none of us would want our stories to, again, be collapsed into like a meritocratic tale of how hard we worked. And yet, of course, this sort of work does seem to suggest that sort of trajectory of struggle, triumph, and so forth that perhaps is very much beholden to the 18th and 19th century legacies of the novel. But I do want to try and complicate that about how uneven those experiences are. And I'm also very open to talking about the process of the book in general. But I think you said like I could speak for about 15 minutes as a way to start. Okay, I'm going to share a screen post. So of course, presuming that people may be less familiar with my work, I thought it'd be good to have a little bit of an overview. And the beautiful artwork that you see is by a dear friend of mine, Lucia Lorenzi, who you can follow on Twitter and on Instagram as @EmpathyWarrior. She's a Black queer feminist scholar and artist, and someone who is also moving out of academia because academia is so anti-Black and so ableist. But I think that as soon as I saw this image, when I was working on my book during the very first coronavirus lockdown, she was over in Vancouver, I was in London. There's something that I think it captured for me of how I'm trying to explore unfeeling as something which is about self-preservation, but also longing, a type of self-sufficiency, but also collectivity and desire and complicated investments. And so much of it that is owed to, again, the beauty and the genius of Lucia's particular work. But just to go so quickly through it, what do I mean when I'm talking about unfeeling? A friend sent this to me before I was going to give a talk last month from CoStar, which is an app some of you might be familiar with that deals with astrology. But as soon as they saw that, they had thought of me, that it said, like, good morning, April 19th. Today at a glance, it's okay to cycle between feeling and not feeling. I think this is what I'm trying to explore in my work, that while I'm looking at 19th century American archives, which I know that Emily is also very invested in, but some of you may be less so, is that what I see as a sort of ongoing theory in the flesh for minoritized subjects, that it's not just about care, but also the ability and the right not to care, to think about unfeeling not simply as oppression from above, and that the minoritized always have to be in the position of begging for sympathy and therefore are never given the occasion to do anything but care. What does it mean to think of unfeeling from below? And this is the provocation that I have, where thinking about the work of, say, people like Lisa Lowe, Lauren Berlant, Kayla Schuler, all which has been very influential for my thought, but sort of rephrasing it and thinking with them as much as against the sort of forces that they're also trying to describe. And so I say, no more business with white sentimentality. Withhold from those colonial intimacies. Refuse to feel according to the hierarchies of the biopolitics of feeling. Be disaffected. And some of the ways I'm thinking about unfeeling are in these three major registers that I hope might be useful for people in terms of thinking more expansively about how we approach work by minoritized people in general, as simply beyond the simply representative, this beyond simply a bid in the politics of recognition. So first, I would consider unfeeling as an index to the under-acknowledged spectrum of dissent that critiques the demand a sympathetic recognition that is shaped by sentimentalism, questioning the liberal project of inclusion. Second, I explore unfeeling in both the responsive and demonstrative senses as a quotidian tactic of survival and a counterintuitive, sometimes counteractive mode of care. And finally, I propose that these antisocial affects are vilified as unfeeling because they have insurgent potential that may not be legible or instrumentalized towards resistance. And I know that this is a bit in the description of the talk, but one way I'd explore this, for instance, is to critique the way that it's been so easy to pick up Herman Melville's Bartleby the Scrivener with his "I prefer not to" as this universal figure of transgression, and yet to ignore that in his whiteness, the entire perspective is told from the perspective of another white male Wall Street lawyer who, no matter what Bartleby does, he always continually extends sympathy to him again and again and again. Instead, I pose, what does it mean to think about Babo, the enslaved Senegalese man who helped to lead this revolt aboard a Spanish slave ship, who ends up being executed, among others, for transgressing against chattel slavery. And reading against the grain, how might unfeeling not just simply be a lack, but also the potential for incipient and insurgent affects that might fall outside a dominant structure of feeling? So, for instance, reading against the grain of the work of something like Enlightenment philosopher Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, where he says, it has been observed by all those who've been conversant with savage nations, whether in Asia, Africa, or America, that they're equally impenetrable, and that when they have a mind to conceal the truth, no examination is capable of drawing it from them. And so here I think we have this a way of seeing that universal feeling, much the way that Sylvia Wynter and Denise Ferreira da Silva critique the Enlightenment creation of universal man, ends up being a type of colonial ruse, which only overrepresents some forms of feeling as true, only some forms of people as legitimately human, only some as capable of the truth. And finally, I guess, like, as just to wrap it up quickly, some productive ways I'm further trying to think about these insurgent possibilities is, for instance, thinking alongside Marxist theorist Raymond Williams' definition of structures of feeling, which is how he says, like, we experience ideology in everyday life. And of course, ideology isn't something consciously chosen, but which is something at the level of feeling that we experience from day to day. But if we think about the dominant structure of feeling as akin to Audre Lorde's Master's House, I think it can help us understand the way that unfeeling can be a type of rupture to enable new structures of feeling to arise. And here I have a line from one of her most famous essays. And here she says, those of us who stand outside the circle of this society's definition of acceptable women, those of us who have been forged in the crucibles of difference, those of us who are poor, who are lesbians, who are Black, who are older, know that survival is not an academic skill. It is learning how to stand alone, unpopular and sometimes reviled, and how to make common cause with those others identified as outside the structures in order to define and seek a world in which we can all flourish. And so unfeeling may seem like absence. It could also be seen legitimately as being antisocial. And yet, to what extent might the antisocial be a refusal of a particular social that overrepresents itself as universal, and a way of opening itself up for other communities and the convergence of other minoritized communities who realize that the very forces that minoritize them aren't the only game in town, and there's other ways to build other worlds. And indeed, that's what Dr. Galila is alluding to, that I'm trying to do in my second chapter, is seeing, for instance, the way that one 19th century radical Black thinker is thinking about the way that Black and Indigenous peoples can be united in resistance against global white supremacy. And part of that has to do with reclaiming indigeneity for African peoples, for instance. And in the end, he, before his, the end of the book, which is, as far as we know, might have been finished, and yet we don't have the final chapters, he even includes East Asian people in this particular vision of this anti-colonial vision of revolution. So hopefully that gives some things to talk about in terms of some frameworks I'm thinking about, perhaps a little hints about the archive. I'm happy to talk about more about the ideas, happy to talk about the writing of the book, delve 19th century stuff. Yeah, Emily,
Yeah, great, thank you. So I actually, for my first question, I was sort of hoping to begin sort of at the end of your book. In so much of your book, you discuss the problem of universal feeling and its kind of relationship to these colonial projects. But in the coda, you map these sort of intimacies, or what you term counter-intimacies, that are non-universal, that, not cut and paste transferable in the way that sort of right feeling would be. These counter-intimacies appear to be intimate, I think, not just in feeling, but from what you described, maybe setting as well. They appear, as you say, across geographic space, but they crop up, as you mentioned, like in online groups, individual chat messages, or the one that I love in particular, the exchange of a mug. So to what extent are these, counter-intimacies, in your opinion, really tied to a sense of a particular time and place? And to what extent are these intimacies sort of predicated on sort of a transhistorical shared experience? So sort of, in other words, what ways are they sort of fleeting and ongoing? So I was hoping you might be willing to speak on that.
Thank you, Emily. So for instance, apropos of the Zoom call, I don't know if anyone's had the experience of using the direct message function during certain talks. I certainly have, where you end up exchanging ideas and thoughts when perhaps the dominant mode of a meeting, when not recorded, because I will have to say, do not use the direct message function if the meeting is being recorded, because I think they have complete access to the chat transcript, can be a way of a sort of lateral way of communicating, which can be fleeting, but those moments, those brief expressions of solidarity can mean everything in that particular moment. And that could be a moment that you return to with a person that you may not know as well, that you can pick up with and then organize in a more consistent fashion later. But whether or not that fleeting moment is marshaled to a complete coherent project of institution building as well as breaking doesn't necessarily matter. So of course, one way I'm using intimacies, as I know Emily already knows, but just for people who might be less familiar, is of course the way that Lisa Lowe talks about intimacies, not simply as the property of the private modern individual, but as structural. And particularly she talks about the intimacies of the entanglements of chattel slavery, indigenous dispossession, and Asian indentured servitude. And that she points out these structural intimacies are what enabled the birth of global modernity and the possibility of the modern liberal subject, who then are white subjects overwhelmingly, who are the ones who have the privileged possibility to be the subjects that have that type of intimate interiority that we usually associate with the word intimacies. And so what's sort of interesting to me is that before her book came out, originally there was an essay that came out, and Anne Stoller's Haunted by Empire. And in it, she talked about what I would consider counter-intimacies, but she doesn't talk about it in quite the same detail in the book itself. And so that's why I'm using counter-intimacies as a way of thinking that despite these hegemonic entanglements, as many people pointed out, there's all these possibilities for Black, Indigenous, Asian peoples to come together. And of course, the way that those categories are not in any way exclusionary, although the way that colonial thinking would want us to think of them as exclusionary, and then therefore silo and therefore divide and conquer, doesn't actually operate that way. So I guess that's a bit of the background. And so in the whole of the book, I'm looking at particular 19th century intimacies and counter-intimacies that I think have particular resonance through to today. And in the coda that Emily so beautifully alluded to, I start thinking about the way that I've lived it, and I think many people that I am intimate with, so to speak, also have navigated them during the time that I've been thinking about and writing the book. And I think that we're very much, these new intimacies arise out of these older historical structural intimacies, and yet the way that they operate can also function very digitally, precisely because of digital spaces, because of, say, the way that we could have certain WhatsApp groups created, certain Facebook groups created, and perhaps there's an interesting contrast between the seeming intractable institutional historical dimension of how these operate on national and international scales, and these more fleeting exchanges on digital platforms, which are, I guess, are sort of fiefdoms for billionaires. Yeah, so I hope that sort of speaks to what you're saying. Like, I think it's like there's something going on in terms of both the structural as well as practices that are enacted in moments that can be ephemeral, but also can lead to forms of change. But also, I don't want to say it has to necessarily lead to that in order to be considered valid.
Yes, thank you. I think at this point, we want to open the floor to other questions. So if anyone would like to ask a question. Yeah, Carlos, would you like to jump in here?
Hi, thank you. Thank you for, I feel weird being the only white man asking the first question, but I also have a very hard problem with silences. I deal very badly with those. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for putting together the presentation. I have your book. I haven't been able to read a word yet. But I promise I have it, and I'm looking forward to it. I'm very interested in feeling, because to some extent it seems to me a sort of meta emotion, and I'm interested in emotions about other emotions. And even in the quote that you just showed up by Adam Smith, there's a certain anxiety about the feelings of the other or the unfeeling of the other. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that sort of, I don't know how to call it, like a chain of emotions in which there's a certain reaction that's emotional, but also discursive, but also political, institutional, to the emotions of the other. And I was wondering whether you had any example in mind, any case that for you illustrates particularly that sort of meta-emotional chain.
Thank you so much, Carlos. And also say happy belated May Day, comrade, seeing your shirt. I say that labor solidarity is an important aspect of how I'm thinking about counterinsurgencies too. And thank you so much for that. So one thing that I'm also trying to emphasize is, I think a relationship between Adam Smith's, like particularly historicized thinking about fellow feeling and sympathy to affect studies, like contemporary affect studies. And as you point out, there's a way that he's theorizing like a meta analysis of feeling. And so one thing I'm really emphasizing is like the ability to be acknowledged, of course, as a fellow capable of fellow feeling is the first condition for the expression, whether an entire expression spectrum of expressiveness and responsiveness as feeling is seen as valid. And so that's why when I'm thinking about unfeeling, on the one hand, I'm thinking about, and I have this whole litany of like saying like frigidity, inscrutability, emotional unavailability, and so forth. But also there's entire spectrums of racialized unfeeling, like particularly I talk about like the whole spectrum of Black expressive emotionality, which is considered unfeeling precisely because it's seen as invalid on the level of recognition. And so one way I explore it, for instance, with the Melville, is that I think he does such a great job of showing how contingent that white supremacist recognition of Black affect is valid is so contingent on the Adam Smith definition, and how readily it collapses, say, someone like Babel from he says like, "Oh, faithful friends." I think he says like, "I can't call you servant or call you slave." And initially you think like, "Oh, he might be not a nice guy." Like he sees him as valid, but no, it's because he only sees humanity in relation to his enslavement. Once he Babo and the other Africans rebel against that, then they're seen as being inhuman. And then the very expressions that were seen as potentially like kind and generous, those same, even the way that they're described becomes completely different. There's an interesting moment in the novella Reading of Sereno when the masquerade's revealed, and as basically the white Spaniards and the white Americans are coming together to fight against the Africans, the white sailors are described as grimly baring their teeth, whereas Black people are described as like with teeth wolfishly barred or something like that. And yet when you actually think about it, it's like the exact same facial expression. But the thing is that the fragile contingent basis of fellow feeling, of seeing Black expressivity as valid, has been violated, and therefore no matter what it is, it's always going to be seen as being or inappropriate. So I hope that kind of helps, and I think it's so interestingly and importantly modulated. Like, so to shift to what I call a structure of unfeeling, which is seen as which is so recognized it becomes stereotype. I think about Oriental inscrutability. And of course, we see this as prevailing stereotype with, like, maybe people might remember the hashtag campaign, Expressive Asians, that happened in relation to the Oscars a number of years ago. And it's something that people bring up. But I think there's something really interesting in how nameable this type of Asiatic unfeeling is, because it also shows to an extent the way that it can be fetishized and aestheticized, which I think also adheres to the relative and problematic but contingent valorization of a type of Asianness that is positioned as also being anti-Black and anti-Indigenous, for instance. And so I think it operates in very different ways. And in that case, of course, it's like it allows for and it recognizes a type of Asiatic withholding from emotion and allows it to be named. Whereas, as I point out when talking about histories of Black insurgency, it's not nameable in quite the same way. Does that sort of help and speak to what you were wondering? Thank you, Carlos.
So it looks like we have a question from Elise.
Hi, thanks. Wonderful talk, Dr. Yao. I'm really excited to read your book. I do 19th century race and enslavement history. So I was thinking very much about Saidiya Hartman's Scenes of Subjection when you were talking about affect. And I'm wondering to what degree we can read unfeeling as a rebellion to sort of this like fun and frolic performance that enslavement demanded. And to what degree you're sort of thinking about that.
Thank you. Like, it's very, my work is very much owes so much to Hartman's. Particularly, I'm thinking about the dialogue she does with Frank Wilderson, where she talks about like sympathy as like one of the fundamental ethical problems for humanity. And that's where, of course, she talks about the slave as the figure of the unthought. And I think unfeeling can be seen as a corollary of that. And so what I think I'm trying to also suggest is, like, on the one hand, there's instances where unfeeling can rise to the level of a global rebellion, as Delaney does, but also comes in like a lot of smaller ways, as the work of Black and Asian women writers that I look at explore. And sometimes it can be very fleeting. And part of what I'm also trying to emphasize is by looking at the work of queer and feminist women of color writers who aren't thought of as affect theorists, like Audre Lorde and Gloria Anzaldúa. And I also try to then read 19th century writers like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper and Sebastian Farr, also as like early women of color theorists about affect, that as much as they're talking about the importance of their feelings, they're also talking about the importance of being able to withhold and not have to partake in the type of obliged play and performances of happiness that Hartman critiques as like obviously the emotional labor to the physical labor required of chattel slavery. And part of it then is sometimes it could rise to the level of volition, but also sometimes, as they describe, unfeeling, I think, is sort of like a callus. And I use how Audre Lorde talks about, in order to, she talks about growing a thick skin. And in one essay, Audre Lorde talks about having to withstand the wet weather, having to become stone. And I see this as something analogous to like having a callus on your hands, that this sort of repetitive demand of emotional labor, it doesn't mean that you choose that type of hardening, but it allows you to get through to where, and to not be hurt by it in the same way. And so there's also a way that it operates, not necessarily on a discursive level, that can operate on a pre-discursive level of just trying to make it through. And sometimes it then can rise to a choice to withhold as well. But precisely the way that Hartman complicates thinking about agency and who gets to have agency, I think that's why I'm particularly interested in feeling and thinking about the possibility of unfeeling, because feeling is so often seen as the indicator of interiority and as evidence of a type of volition. And indeed, in affect studies, the very way that people tend to say, oh, this is affect versus emotion. Affect is seen as the pre-discursive, the physical, and like the instinctual, whereas emotion is seen as like the psychologized and conscious. And I'm not really interested in saying pigeonholing which is which, but rather the way that Hartman also makes us understand, like it's a way of tracking who is seen as having agency, whose affects are seen as being valid as affects, whose feelings are seen as valid as emotions at different times. It's more about like the ruses, the taxonomy of power in terms of how these things get pigeonholed. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Thank you so much.
Would anyone else like to ask a question?
So thank you, Magnolia, for your kind words. I saw your message.
Yes. Dr. Gaia.
Thanks, Emily. I have tons of questions, so I'll just start with one, which is self-centered, and that is to share that when reading your book, I've obviously been thinking a lot about my own research and concept of feeling yellow, and I'm thinking through, and I know that you've read that essay too, so I actually just wanted to hear, like, what are your thoughts of possible overlaps with these theories, but also tensions therein, because I think there's some similarities in the sense of trying to grow a thick skin and withholding especially expressions of pleasure and joy that white people feel in the audience when they're watching Yellowface on stage. And I'm just like cold and horrible and not applauding and laughing, but I'm still feeling a lot. And so I'm grappling with how I actually have like such intensity of feeling. And at the same time, I'm also like, I'm puzzling over this kind of representation sympathy trap that often happens in theater of color, where we have stories centered on people of color in order to gain sympathy from a dominantly white audience to recognize them as human. And yet that very structure just reinforces structural white supremacy and white folks getting to use their yardstick to decide who gets to measure up to humanity. And so I've been thinking through the trap of that and the extent to which unfeeling, or I'm editing this issue on Asian American dramaturgies, and various scholars and artists like Amy Ginther, and I know you've cited like Summer Kim Lee and Vivian Huang, just thinking through like refusals of participating in this dynamic. So like, what are these relationships with possibilities of like feeling yellow, and then how do we deal with this trap?
Thank you. So, like, and I have to. I read your essay when it first came out, which was very timely because I think it was about the same time that I went to go see M. Butterfly. No, not M. Butterfly. That would be too much credit. Madame Butterfly at the Vancouver Opera Company in Yellowface, where of course Vancouver perhaps is very famously, perhaps infamously, an Asian city, and yet like was pretty much in yellowface. So it was very close to home, and I could feel a fellow feeling akin to the sort of cringe response. And yet, of course, I also chose to go see it because I also like the music. And no, it wasn't Benjamin Butterfly. It was actually Turandot, I remember, which I think is also interesting because it wasn't until fairly recently in my life, having grown up listening to opera, that I realized that Turandot was supposed to be about China, because that is not a Chinese name. I don't know if I didn't know that Nessun Dorma was supposed to be set in China, in case anyone didn't know that either. Which, oh goodness. But from what I remember your work, like I think that for me, like I think that it's how I'm thinking about unfeeling is very much in dialogue with how you're thinking about it, because it's about a refusal to participate in a type of politics of recognition as part of the audience, and the type of withholding of the conventions of dominant expressiveness when you're maybe expected to laugh and play along. And I think that people can react angrily, but there's also, what I'm trying to do is like open up space, not just for like the negative feelings and what people, of course, CNI famously calls the ugly feelings, but how people also, we can sometimes choose to be non-responsive because that's the only thing you can do in the moment, because you also don't want to make a commotion and then make yourself even more hyper visible as perhaps the only Asian person in the audience, where you feel like people might be looking at you to see expressions of whether or not they are allowed to laugh or not. And yet, of course, it doesn't mean that you don't feel deeply, but sometimes I think also feeling nothing in terms of shock is valid. It makes me think about how in my 5th chapter, I'm thinking about with Edith Maud Eaton, who I sort of named Feast and Fire's work. And she often insists about how her feelings are so large and her heart is so delicate. And yet she also nonetheless returns to this inscrutability, this way of saying, like she says, like her phrase is like, the Chinaman does not wear his heart on his sleeve, in a way of like inverting it. Like instead it's like just because you don't show it doesn't mean it's not happening. And that perhaps precisely because she is vulnerable as a subject, and the way she's talking about what seems like her unnamed chronic illness is also through the language of complicating sympathy and sentimentalism. It necessitates a type of unfeeling as a survival tactic in order to make it through. Yeah, and I guess it's also this frustration, as you say, like for theater, but also so many other modes, that I also experience a lot, even more so in the UK, because Asian American studies, Asian diasporic studies doesn't really exist here. And so it feels like when I'm teaching anything, it feels like I have to start from like the basic ground of, did you know we wrote things too? And I don't like it. And I felt like initially I felt like I was so eager to do that work of like, yay, I'm teaching the students this. And they're like, oh my God, this is the first East Asian writer we've ever read. And I was like, wow, the bar is really low. And then I realized, yes, the bar is low. And because of that, I have to make sure that I don't simply meet a pedagogical demand to just like multiply types with then a type of transparency, but then to sort of complicate like, hey, maybe a lot of my students do identify with Feast and Fire's work, but then it's like, what parts frustrate you? What parts seem are opaque? What parts do you seem to withhold or frustrate? The way that she talks in particular stories, the way she keeps on showing the way that sympathetic white women are often like end up being the villains. Like, how might the very impulses of trying to know more as a type of ethics that is about how, you know, literature makes us more human, makes us understand other people, can also be a trap in and of itself. And I think that's also forced me, I think, to be a better teacher rather than to just sort of info dump, I guess, and just be like, here are all these Asian writers exist, and here's this person, this person. No, I'll be like, this, I have to give them background, but how can I'm also trying to teach them in an ethical methodology of engagement as well.
I apologize. I have a lot of background noise right now. It looks like we have some more comments in our chat, and then I was going to open up the floor again for questions.
So I see Emily has spoken, and I'm just going to read out their question. Thank you very much. In an extra textual way, I might use if you have any pedagogical observations about disaffected measures or strategies, and they may apply to syllabi crafting and colleague interactions during surreal times of the pandemic. Ooh. The problem, well, first of all, I don't make syllabi anymore because for some reason my department only does team taught stuff. And so it's weird in the UK and within my field. I don't get to have that type of control anymore. Instead, it's like these moments of like seminars, a particular lecture. Sometimes I can be given a seminar, which is just 4 sessions. And so I have a bunch of them coming up and I feel obligated. I can't afford to teach any white things because if I don't teach all different people of color things, then they might not happen. So for instance, I'm going to be teaching this one that's about like women of color writing modernity. I'm going to be teaching a Muslim turn of the century writer. I'm going to be teaching also a Harlem Renaissance woman writer. I'm going to be teaching Suisun Far. I'm going to be teaching Zeke Khalasa. And the sort of challenge is like, yes, I'm trying to like hit all these things because otherwise, if I don't teach them, no one's going to teach like Indigenous or East Asian or probably like Muslim woman writers. But also, again, like what is the method to do that? So I think like part of it is like, how do you draw people in but not give them everything? And so, of course, I want to attract the students who care about women of color writing, but then to know that the care is not enough in and of itself, and how to complicate their effective investment in curiosity and pedagogical exploration, and to also understand and complicate it alongside a long history of obviously both a colonial epistemological imperative and prerogative, which also becomes an effective one as well. And that the way that we teach, if we don't teach in ways that are thoughtful and just teach on the level of just care as opposed to teaching how to care better and teach and withhold, like we end up replicating it. Perhaps beyond syllabi crafting, one thing I've been thinking a lot is the way that those of us who teach are so responsible for our student care, but also we're working in institutions that care so little about us as well. And so what becomes very difficult is everyone is incredibly low on resources of all kinds. But there can be these inadvertent cruelties that are less apparent because we don't have as much time and care for students, or students then want everything from us because they're getting so little. And I say what I've been trying to think about with my interactions with students, like how can I not be a repository of all the care because I'm not capable of it, but how do I model and also teach sustainable ways of care and caring as a mutual and reciprocal relationship. And so I think I've been very lucky that I've had students who also like check in on me as well. And I also try to be transparent and be like share vulnerabilities precisely, I think, to know that also like it's not quite the same because I have job security for one thing, but I think it helps to make the care work of teaching visible as work, and also to think that it can also extend beyond like a client's relationship as neoliberal university might want us to think. For the colleague interaction, I was really struck, there's a study that came out like a number of months ago that showed like employees of color have been flourishing way more by working from home than having to work in the office. And a lot of that has to do about working in spaces where they don't have to deal with as much bullshit. And as much as I think that I do feel like a loss of being able to interact with all of my colleagues. Like, I think that is also true, like, because you have to be more intentional, it allows us to be more careful about how care is allocated. And I think the automatic response can be for people who are used to in-person interaction, like they're for nothing, and then it becomes incredibly difficult. But I think if we were intentional and think about it, it then means that we do more in terms of building community, in terms of engaging with others. Or sometimes it could also be like for more shitty interactions in larger settings, you have to turn your camera off so people don't see how you react. Or, you can text outside of the view of the webcam in peripheral vision, I think is one way that that emerges. So I don't know if that sounds a bit cynical, but I feel like maybe the pandemic, precisely because of the very paradox of social distancing and masking as a type of inexpressiveness, which actually paradoxically often forms of care for others. I think that we're being given a chance to be more conscientious about the type of calculus of care and uncare and the allocation of attention and expressiveness and responsiveness that has otherwise become a norm, especially when the neoliberal university and institutions in general are trying to commodify type of kindness and care in really disingenuous ways. And I think, yeah, it's to me been really interesting to say the way that I think anti-work discourse has really been flourishing and been making the mainstream precisely because of these frustrations around the pandemic. And I think a lot of it has to do with these critiques of the effective dimension of these other forms of labor that are expected. So thank you for that question, and I hope that that's also helpful.
All right, so I'd like to just open up the floor again, and if anyone has any additional questions.
Hi, I have a question. Hi, Dr. Yao. Thank you for coming. I'm not familiar with your work, but I'm really intrigued by everything you're saying. So I can't wait to pick up the book. And I was wondering, just looking at the title of the book, if there was, the cultural politics of unfeeling, and made me think of Ahmed's The Cultural Politics of Emotion. So I was just wondering to what extent you feel like you're in dialogue with Ahmed's work in that book, and I guess it's sort of even continuing with Donatella's question of just kind of where you see the overlaps and tensions with Ahmed's work.
Thank you. So one thing I say in my introduction is like, from my title, but also the construction of the book is very much indebted, not just in terms of ideas, but also structure to Sara Ahmed's work, but also Xine Yau's work. Like the way that I structure each of my chapters has to do on these differently racialized, queer and gendered modes of unfeeling. And I'm very much thinking about how the way that they approach it. On a much more, this might be a slight humble brag thing, but Sara Ahmed did DM me to congratulate me the book was out. So I was like, yay, we're in literal dialogue. Like this is everything that I would have dreamt of as a grad student. And I've been very lucky to have met her in person. And yeah, I think that she was the first theorist that I read that like brought together thinking about what race, post-colonialism, gender, feminism, queerness in such a deft way. And it's also been very sobering coming to the UK and realizing that just a couple years before she left the UK higher education because of how hostile it got, because her institution, Goldsmiths, refused to actually reckon with this high profile sexual harasser because he's a full professor. And there's a point at which like even someone as powerful, as brilliant as Sara Ahmed chose to walk away. And I think that's also important to bear in mind that like talking about the survival strategies, but sometimes survival might also be not being in such an inhospitable place. It's also been weird to say that, for instance, her second to most recent book, so most recent one being Complaint, but before that, The Use of Abuse, an entire chapter of how she's talking about colonial education and the cooptation and how EDI is a form of, or DEI is a form of control, and eugenics is based on my institution, UCL, which is the home of, well, sort of in some ways like the home of eugenics as it is. And it's weird to be doing this sort of work in that legacy. And so her work has been like very actively helping me navigate like the very recent institutional history of where I am, which is just a couple of years ago. I guess in terms of tensions of the work, I don't know if it's necessarily tensions, but I think it's like, what I like about dialogue as a phrase is it allows us to think about responding to silences that someone else's silences, not as a gotcha moment or like their omission, but them making space for you and then you entering the space because they want to hear from you. And so I think that's one way I'm trying to think about unfeeling, because I say, like, for instance, the way that she theorized about affect aliens was very influential to me. And I was thinking like, well, what about this next stage of being alienated from affect itself? The way that, like, again, unfeeling, I'm saying, is like this illegibility, this falling outside, this politics of recognition of the intelligibility. And so I think like things like how she talks about melancholic migrants and other things very much is relevant to that, and to stay with the possibility of unfeeling. So it doesn't have to be recuperated, not just to happiness, but recuperated as feeling. Because often a way that, especially like older work by people of color, is like, and then they had to prove that Black or Chinese people were actually human because they thought that they weren't, and like they also had feelings too. But what does it mean to say suspend that sort of moment of having to do the work and be like, no, what if it's okay to stay with that sort of unfeeling because it's a type of refusal, it's something that falls outside the gaze, this colonial gaze of what can be seen as legible and coherent as appropriate feeling. And I think that, and one thing I hope that's inspired me about her work, that I also hope I'm able to replicate, is the way that I think her work has been precisely so generative, in the way that she gives us ideas that we can take up so differently in different disciplines in different places. And to have it not just be the, well, this person doesn't cover this part, because that sort of critique, which is, I think, often the first mode of critique that we tend to be taught, is easy to go to, but then eventually when you start writing, it becomes overwhelming, because we realize like, no, you can't actually hit everything. But actually to realize that sometimes the writing is about making things that are useful and making spaces for other people to sort of step in and be in conversation with you. And thank you, Donna. So I'm just going to read out Dr. Gell's comment saying that about, I have a section on the presumed whiteness of affect studies and this bibliography of queer color theorists like Ahmed. And I think there's also something very perennial that like Ahmed was doing something with both reading people like Smith, like Kant, but also reading like Lord as well. Like she's also doing this politics of citation about who we turn to. And yet she's someone who can also be erased very readily. Like maybe because her work is popular or seen as accessible, like it's not, you know, the same level of elitist, coherent, like continental philosophy. Of course, these are all in dialogue with each other in different ways. But I guess what's also sort of chilling is to think like even someone who is a giant like Ahmed can also be rendered like unsighted, as it were.
Thank you for that. Yeah, and I loved what you were saying about the dialogue and the spaces. I definitely feel like you know, I'm nearing the end of my graduate studies, but there's still always like it's such a great metaphor of thinking about about entering academic dialogue in a way that's not as like scary and as like competitive as like people, you know, try to make it sound like you have to come up with the next new thing. Kind of pressure. So I appreciate that difficult. A lot.
And I was just like grading master's essays. So I was thinking about it a lot precisely because either I think initially like when we start doing this work, we can be overly deferential, but then to overcombat that, then people can be like overly combative, like this person misses this part. But then we realize like we don't want people to treat us like that. So how do we enter in generosity? And I think that's incredibly challenging. I see there's a comment from Andrita that maybe I'll read out. So as someone currently thinking about 18th, 19th century discourse and apathy, specifically looking at how apathy circulated within colonial commodities, I myself referring to your work very often. Thank you for writing this book and powerful coda. Thank you. Did you want to ask me else think particular about it? I think it's absolutely awesome how you're looking at this.
Yeah, I'm a first year PhD student here at the Department of English. So I'm very, I don't know that I have very coherent thoughts at the moment. But I was really taken with everything in your book. So I don't have, I just, you know, I'm basically just gushing at this point because yeah, like I'm, you know, reading odes on apathy, thinking about sort of, I don't know, soporifics of colonial commodities and how like kind of the material underpinnings of apathy in certain ways, and then also completely differently. I was reading kind of 21st century techno-orientalism and everything that you say about inscrutability and the presentation of that unfeeling and how it's mobilized now to, you know, marginalized populations in chains of production and so on. So yeah, I don't have a question. I'm just like,
no, I think
happy.
Oh, thank you. I've also been told that despite talking about unfeeling so much, I tend to talk a lot about my feelings about things, but I do not see that as a contradiction, which is my point. Like, I don't see, like, from a certain perspective, like the anti-social turn is about turns to different forms of radically different forms of the social. So thank you for being in dialogue with my work. Yeah, because I guess like one thing to also think about from the 18th, 19th century through to today is like, it's like thinking about work discourse, that people say like, oh, it's so terrible that at work you have to like hide who you really are and so forth. But sometimes it's more convenient. Sometimes you don't want to bring your whole self to work because that becomes totalizing, and maybe work doesn't deserve my whole self, right? It doesn't deserve, I don't have to, shouldn't have to bring all my identities to the door and declare them. Like, it's okay for me not to bring it. And like this, a resistance to a type of commodification, but also perhaps one that perversely delights in perhaps a sort of ornamentalist objecthood, because I know that I'm a type of commodity to university, and then I'll just be like a silent commodity, and I'll just be like, I'm not going to give you anything right now. I will just not smile and not react to this, like the piece of circulated international Asiatic labor I am, who's wondering if I'm going to be able to get my visa extended later, you know?
All right, so we have a couple more comments in our chat here.
So I see Magnolia talking about their work on dance and affect, and taxonomies and Hmong dance, which I know nothing about. So thank you for talking about it. I hope to be able to read your work someday. And I guess it's interesting, especially for dance, as someone who knows, well, used to do dancing, but ages ago, is that because it's posed in as expressivity, right? It's like the paradox of what forms of expressiveness are seen as valid, or if it always has to be seen as expressing in a certain way and therefore falling into a sort of universalist taxonomy. Yes, and Avatar: The Last Airbender, I think is relevant to all this, which might seem odd, but actually I think it really continues my interest in counter-intimacies. And so I have like another article where I'm really trying to think about like Asian anti-Blackness and like Black and Asian counter-intimacies, and then like my Avatar: The Last Airbender work is trying to think about relationships between Asianness and indigeneity, which of course is like, I know that a book by Juliana Hugh-Pegues has just come out called Space-Time Colonialism, but I haven't had a chance to read it yet. And I think it does some of this fantastic work of like breaking down Asian and Indigenous as inherently exclusionary categories, and talking about how like the alienness of Asianness operates as also a type of settler colonial tactic by white settlers in Alaska, for instance. But for instance, one thing I talk about in my article that is related to unfeeling is, spoiler alert for people who haven't watched the show, the way that Zuko chooses a chosen family over his own family. And I think it's about, he just finally decides to divest himself of like a patriarchal honor-bound mode of feeling, which ties him to an abusive family, and decides to choose other forms of affiliation.
All right, so I think we are pretty much out of time, but I wanted to thank everyone for being part of the talk, and thank you, Dr. Yao, for your just wonderful engagement today, and it was so great to be able to ask and hear some of these questions.
Thank you so much, Emily. Thank you, Dr. Gala, for all your work. Thank you to Catherine, who set up this stuff. Thank you for all of you for being here. It's been wonderful to get your questions.